So welcome. This is amazing. The first Reinforce. And I'm pretty sure this might be the first kind of session, right? I don't know if I get an award maybe for that. We'll see. But pretty awesome. So I'm happy to be here. So my name is Jeff Westphal. Today we're going to focus on pragmatic container security. So essentially what we're going to do is dive a little deeper in what it means to secure your container infrastructure. So I've been working for Trend Micro now for roughly 5 years. Before my current role as the technical lead for the Great Lakes team, I worked with a lot of companies throughout the whole US, helping them with their overall cloud adoption, their cloud migration process, but really focusing on just one of our solutions, and that's deep security. So deep security is our hybrid cloud solution. So when I say hybrid cloud, that means physical servers, that means virtual servers, that means cloud, then that means containers, and it means serverless, right? So all aspects of your infrastructure with one single solution. So I usually start out my presentations with like a meme, maybe a Dilbert or something, but I have a quote here. It worked on my machine. How many developers do we have hanging out? A lot. Great. All right, you guys are going to love this story. So I got a funny story to go with this. I'll try to make this quick. We'll go back 8-9 years ago, and I'm this hotshot IT admin. I got all these hats on, right? I do Citrix and VMware, Active Directory Exchange, right? That's my role. And we rotated on call. We're the infrastructure team, so we're the top level support team. We rotate on call, we do tickets. I get this ticket that comes in, and it has the role of this individual. It says application developer. And I look at this ticket and I think, we have an application development team? Like what? And I've been working for this company for like 3 years. I had no idea. And we're talking to the guys around, you know, we're all kind of hanging out together. Oh, it's those guys across the hall, those application developers. We didn't even know who they were, what they did, right? Anyway, this guy's ticket, in his description, it's essentially what this quote says. It says, I got this application I built on my laptop, and it's not working on this server that you provisioned for me. And it says, I need unfettered access to this server. And I'm not going to lie, that was the first time I heard the word unfettered. And I thought it was hilarious. I'm like, who does this dude think he is to tell me he wants unfettered access on one of our servers? So we're getting a kick out of this on the infrastructure team. And of course, I kick it back over to him in a very nice way. I was just basically said, no. And he does what every developer does, throws a tangent, sends it up the chain, complains and cries, but guess what? Guess who won that battle? We did. They were like, no, buddy, make your application work. Get out of here, right? And I tell this story because times have certainly changed, wouldn't you say? If that guy put in that ticket now, first of all, he probably wouldn't even have to put in a ticket like that now when we have CI/CD pipelines and we're automating everything, right? We don't need that kind of access. But if he did, that thing would be a P1 ticket. I'd have a VP knocking on my cube saying, you better get this guy his unfettered access right now before you do anything else for the rest of the day, right? And it's because the business needs to move faster, right? Now the developers wear all the hats. The developers have the power in the IT team. So as security engineers now, we have to follow what the developers are asking us to do, right? It's not the other way around anymore. So we can no longer make security a design constraint for our development team. And that's where containers come in, right? So now we can build and run and ship containers anywhere, run on any infrastructure. We can automate everything, and we can move fast at the speed of business. We can't slow down the business as a development team or in IT. But then at the same time, as a security engineer, I see this quote, and all I see is 2 words, loosely isolated, right? And that scares the heck out of me as a security engineer. So your development team comes over to me, and now I have to listen to everything you say, and I definitely know who you are. And you tell me we have this new thing called containers, this is where we run our application, and then I look up containers and I see loosely isolated, and it scares me. I don't know what that means, right? And here's the perfect example of that. Everybody remembers the Runcie vulnerability, not too old now, right? At the same time, just very high level for those that don't know, we can compromise a container, thus compromising the host, and now affecting the entire machine, affecting the entire container host and all the containers running on it. Just one simple vulnerability, right? So this is an easy example of what they mean by loosely isolated. So I've done a couple of these dev chats, I've done reInvents, I've done the summits and things like that. And for years ago, I was doing a lot of education on the shared security model and what that meant. So as we go through the talk today, you'll hear a lot about Amazon native shared services, or security services, I'm sorry. You'll hear about a lot of gaps that may exist from a security standpoint of things that Amazon just doesn't offer, right? But I think we're all already beyond this, right? We already understand the shared security model. We understand how it changes as you move from different platforms, right? So as we go through the talk today and we kind of highlight different aspects of security, we'll already understand where there's an Amazon native security service and where there may be a gap to fill with an Amazon partner. So we'll cover 6 key areas here, right? And we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper into each one of these, and we'll just give you a better understanding of things to consider when you are building out your container infrastructure. And we'll start with the environment. So I say this, we're going to use mostly Amazon native services here, right, for our CI/CD pipeline. We're using ECR for our container registry, for our orchestration utilities. We may be using something like EKS, maybe Kubernetes. We get down to the container host, we could be using EC2, ECS, Fargate, more like serverless type infrastructure, right? And then we get into the containers. But then those containers could be talking to other services, like Aurora, maybe S3. And then we have our security at the edge as well. We have an ELB and maybe an API gateway, maybe a WAF. Right? So just to give you a high-level overview of what we're going to be focusing on when we talk about these different areas or aspects of security. And we'll start with the container host. I moved past that one really quick. First key point, a container-specific operating system. I think pretty straightforward, right? When you're building out your container infrastructure, look for an operating system that's already hardened, that's already removed a lot of those services. At the same time, if you need additional hardening, look at some of the compliance frameworks out there, right? Look at the requirements for NIST and SANS and use those as kind of a reference to harden your systems even further. And I always like to pick on NIST. NIST 853, anybody doing NIST compliance here? A lot of people in the federal space maybe. As you are aware, that is probably the biggest nightmare when it comes to compliance. And there is a quick start that we actually built with Amazon out there. Has a full CloudFormation template that deploys a NIST 853 compliant architecture. Where I'm going with this is there's a 1,600 line spreadsheet available that outlines where there's an Amazon native security service requirement, where there may be an AWS partner like Trend Micro that can fill that requirement, or maybe it's a shared control of some kind. All right, so use those as a reference when you want to harden your operating systems further. And I think adding logging and monitoring is something that we've come to understand. You could be doing something like CloudTrail, maybe CloudWatch. But then what about log inspection? What about integrity monitoring, right? There's additional security controls that you should consider when you're running EC2. And I think patching is pretty straightforward. We all get this. We all may be shaking our heads like, all right, yeah, I know I need to patch, right? It's not the easiest thing to do. It's easy to say. But then look for, again, an Amazon partner that offers an IPS control that can do some form of virtual patching. All right, I'll touch on this a little bit later. Trend Micro Deep Security can essentially apply a rule to block known vulnerabilities, but we're not making a change to your system, right? We're not updating anything. We're not changing anything. All we're doing is applying a rule that looks for the vulnerability in the data of the packet, and if we see it, we drop it, okay? So while patching can become difficult, there are ways to make it easier for you. And you'll hear me talk about this throughout the talk today is IAM. IAM is going to play a key role in a lot of the services we talk about, and it's going to be the same concept, right? Apply that principle of least privilege. And I mentioned log inspection, I mentioned integrity monitoring. There's things like application control, I mentioned IPS, right? Anti-malware is another easy example. There's additional firewall controls that I'll mention later. Right, so there are additional security services you should consider when you're running EC2. When we jump into Fargate, more on this later when we talk about the application, obviously a managed service. There's nowhere to put an agent here. So we're back to the IAM roles as the number one priority, right? Principle of least privilege. And on ECS, look for an AMI, that's optimized to run ECS, right? Pretty straightforward. On the network side, and this is when we're talking to customers and we're educating customers on what it means to secure your container infrastructure, and we start talking about the network, usually this is the thing that everybody immediately kind of understands, because we've been doing network security for so long. We understand routing and switching and firewalls and access control lists, right? So we get the concept of network security. Obviously that changes a little in the cloud, right? But we still understand the concept as security engineers. So if I hear any moaning or groaning when I talk about VPC Flow Logs, I totally get it, right? Very difficult to read. Doesn't provide that much information all the time, I totally get it. But you should still turn on your VPC Flow Logs. There's additional services like GuardDuty, like I'll mention later, that require this. But then there's also Amazon partners that offer additional firewall controls that can provide more information than those VPC Flow Logs can offer. And the same concept with the IAM roles applies to security groups, right? A host should not be communicating with another host over certain ports. Don't leave them open, right? Apply that principle of least privilege. And encryption, again, something we probably already understand. We get this, right? Encrypt your data at rest, encrypt your data in transit. Anytime you have encryption capabilities available, use those options if you can. On the EC2 and ECS side, I mentioned the IPS rules, right? So now we can apply IPS rules using an agent on the EC2 instance in this case. When we do that, again, we're simply applying a rule to look for a vulnerability, and we're dropping a packet based on that vulnerability. We're not adding anything, we're not changing anything, right? So it makes it an easier way to mitigate some of these vulnerabilities without actually installing anything, right? And here's the big key when we talk about inter-container traffic. When I mentioned earlier that a lot of security engineers understand the concepts of network security, this is oftentimes something they miss, right? Those edge services that you're used to using do not offer any method to monitor and log inter-container traffic, right? There's going to be several containers running on your host, and those containers may be communicating with one another. There needs to be a way to log and monitor that traffic. So don't leave that as a gap in your visibility. What about the AWS WAF? So think of the AWS WAF as like the super edge, right? You as a customer have your edge within your Amazon environment. The AWS WAF is Amazon's edge. So if we can apply rules to block vulnerabilities from reaching you as a customer's environment, why not? Leverage that service. Now I know I say that, and again, maybe some moans and groans because the rule set is fairly limited, but that's where you need to look for an Amazon partner that offers that level of integration, right? So there's an integration with deep security that allows us to share rule sets with the AWS WAF. So while out of the box, sure, that rule set could be fairly limited, but now we have a trusted partner that can share that rule set directly with the WAF and block those attacks before they even reach your environment. And remember what I mentioned the VPC flow logs earlier? That's great if you're using GuardDuty, right? You need those flow logs to trigger a GuardDuty finding. And I always like to use an easy example with GuardDuty. It's just an attacker running a basic reconnaissance scan against your environment. The VPC flow logs are going to see that, right? That's going to trigger a GuardDuty finding. Hey, somebody is running a recon against my environment. Okay, but wouldn't it be great if there was an integrated service that could trigger an action based on that event? So now we have an attacker who runs a recon. VPC flow log sees that, it triggers a GuardDuty finding. And now deep security can go back and verify that all the necessary IPS rules are applied to those instances where that finding was discovered, right? So again, it goes back to why integration is key and how you can leverage Amazon native services with an Amazon partner as well. On the management stack side, we're talking ECR, right? Manage your write permissions as trust becomes a key, right? So always follow the same concept we talked about earlier. Don't apply write permissions to just anyone, right? Pretty straightforward. And here you're going to hear me talk about this more in the build pipeline, but this is where we get into more pre-deployment security controls, right? Where we can potentially scan our images before they're pushed to production, before they're in a registry, before they're actually in a container themselves, right? So we've been focusing on the network. We focused on the EC2 instances, right? ECS. At the same time, those are runtime controls, right? Those are runtime security controls. When we get into the actual scanning of our images, now we're talking more pre-deployment controls, okay? So two different aspects of security here. And you'll hear me mention this a couple times. It's all about automation, right? We get this. Everything needs to be automated. So your systems should be the ones accessing that registry. This should not be a manual process. Kubernetes is great. I'm sure we'd all agree, but maybe it's just me. I think it's fairly complex, right? So don't run it if you don't have to. Amazon offers a service, we'll talk about in a second, that allows you to run Kubernetes in a managed format, right? If you are running Kubernetes, great. Just restrict access to the management interface. Pretty straightforward. There are CIS benchmarks out there for security that's built for Kubernetes or developed around Kubernetes. So use those as a reference when you are trying to secure your Kubernetes infrastructure. If you are running EKS, we're back to those IAM rules, right? Those IAM policies. Follow that principle of least privilege, okay? Same concept with the security groups, right? Don't provide access to that control plane if it's not necessary. And there are native Kubernetes security controls that you can leverage. Take advantage of those. Role-based access control is the most easy to pinpoint, right? So take advantage of those native controls within Kubernetes if you can. And now we get into the build pipeline. And this is, again, where we start to talk more about pre-deployment security controls, okay? This is where security concepts start to change a little bit. And we might be using Amazon native services. We could be using our own third-party or Amazon partners for our build pipeline. But the first key concept is, again, back to those IAM roles, principle of least privilege, and add that scanning that I mentioned earlier at various stages of your build pipeline, okay? Add a scan before that image is actually uploaded. Every time that image is changed, add a security scan. Look for vulnerabilities, look for malware, look for embedded code, look for embedded secrets, Add a second scan before that registry is pushed, before that container is in production, add a second scan. Again, looking for vulnerabilities, looking for malware, right? All of this process can be automated. You can inject this scanning process into your build pipeline and still have an automated method to deploy that application, okay? This, again, goes back to pre-deployment security controls. And then add additional security tests, right? Validate all of your security assumptions, right? This is simple best practices around coding, right? At the same time, those security tests can provide additional insight and visibility into what your application is actually doing. If you are running your own pipeline, your own services, just, again, go back to those principles we talked about earlier in EC2. And here's where we pick on the developers a little bit, again. And I say this because this is a trend micro prediction for this year and again for next year and again going into 2020. And you're not seeing it too much just yet. But we predict that developers are going to become the main target for attack. And I say that just thinking from a BEC perspective. Business email compromise attacks are primarily focused on what? Right? VPs, engineers, directors, CISOs, right? This is where the email attacks are really targeting. what we predict is that developers are going to become the main focus for these BEC attacks going forward, right? As an attacker, I now realize that I can get closer to that application, I can get into that build pipeline, and I can inject my vulnerabilities or inject malware where I need to. So developers are going to become the target for these attacks. And I say that because what happens as a developer anytime you're running into any issue on your machine? What's the first thing that you turn off? It's security, right? We can't do that. We need to follow process and procedure. We need to have additional security controls outside of just malware running on our machines as developers, right? We need to have IPS. We need to have integrity monitoring, log inspection, right? So think of these additional controls as developers we should probably be leveraging because, again, you guys will become now the targets. When we get into the application foundation, again, now we're focusing on that image scan. Okay. So where we can add different various stages of the scanning to our build pipelines. But this is where we hit a kind of a crossroad. And we talked about runtime controls, and then we talked about pre-deployment security controls. Okay, so what if we could apply that image scanning to our build pipeline to give us visibility into what vulnerabilities, maybe malware, embedded secrets exist? Sure, maybe we could stop that build. We could roll it back. But what if we could make the business aware that these vulnerabilities exist at pre-deployment, and then at runtime, apply rules to block those same vulnerabilities, right? So now we're focusing on one single security control. At pre-deployment, can tell you what vulnerabilities exist. And maybe as a business, we may say, hey, any critical vulnerabilities, we want to roll that back. We're not going to deploy that to production. But any low, medium, high vulnerabilities, maybe we want to push that to production. We don't have time. We need to continue to move faster, right? As a business, we can't allow these low, medium vulnerabilities to slow us down. But now we're aware that these vulnerabilities exist before it's actually deployed. And now we have our runtime controls in place that is aware of those vulnerabilities, that can now apply rules to block those attacks at runtime. So it's critical, again, to have one single security control that can do pre-deployment and runtime security. Now we can automate this entire process, secure your infrastructure throughout that entire pipeline. And getting into the application itself, I mentioned earlier Fargate, right, as a perfect serverless example, right? Maybe Lambda. And here we're getting into reducing the services and the tools and the containers, right? We get that. Monitoring our port usage, right? Don't open unnecessary ports. And track your requirements closely, not just security requirements. This could be compute, this could be memory, right? This could be network requirements. Just monitor those and keep track of those as your application is in production. And the other key point I mention here, or I want to mention here, is this is where we start to hear more about RASP, right? So when we talk about runtime application self-protection, now we're actually injecting security into our code itself. So now there's no agent to install anywhere. This is a completely serverless environment, okay? We don't have an agent option. But now what if we could inject security into the actual code? Now we can make the developer aware directly where those vulnerabilities exist, if there's malware in your code. And not only give you that visibility that it exists, but show you where in the code, show you what lines of code are where that vulnerability exists. So our goal overall is just that systems work as intended, and only as intended, right? This is where we want to follow all of those principles we talked about in those 6 kind of key areas. We kind of drilled into each one of those a little bit deeper, helping you understand or give you different options, make you aware of the different controls that are maybe Amazon native security services, maybe again an Amazon partner like Trend Micro can provide some of those services. And I mentioned earlier our hybrid cloud solution, Deep Security, right, where we talked about one single security control that can do pre-deployment and runtime security. One API-driven solution that can run in your orchestration software, protecting virtually any platform and securing all aspects of your infrastructure. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming. I believe there's a session survey. I hope we all had a great first session, right? I'm right on time. You guys enjoy the show. And if you have any questions, I'll be over here hanging out. Otherwise, I'll be by the booth later, 6:31, I think it is. So thank you, everybody.